Her billionaire husband shamed her, but 15 minutes after one phone call, 20 limousines pulled up. That was the moment Julian Thorne's life effectively ended. Though as he stood on his golden stage, drunk on his own power, he had absolutely no idea that he was insulting the only person in the room who could buy and sell his entire existence before breakfast. The humiliation didn't start with a whisper, it started with a spotlight. It was the night of the Thorne Tower grand opening, an event broadcast live to millions. Julian, looking sharp in a $5,000 tuxedo, signaled for the orchestra to stop. The room went silent. He called his wife, Sarah, to the stage. Sarah, dressed in a modest, gray suit that she had worn for years, walked up timidly, thinking he was going to thank her for standing by him when he was nobody. She was wrong. Julian grabbed the microphone and let out a cruel, dry laugh that echoed through the hall. He put his arm around her, not to hug her, but to hold her in place like a prop. He looked at the crowd and apologized. He said he was sorry for the eyesore on stage. He told the city's elite that a skyscraper like this deserved a queen, but for the last 10 years, he had been stuck with a maid. Then, he escalated the cruelty. He gestured to the VIP section, and a 22-year-old supermodel named Vanessa stood up, blowing him a kiss. Julian looked back at Sarah and grinned. He told her that her contract as his starter wife had expired. He said he needed someone who looked good on a magazine cover, not someone who looked like she washed the floors. To make sure the humiliation was absolute, Julian reached under the podium. He didn't pull out divorce papers. He pulled out a dirty, oil-stained microfiber rag used by the construction crew. He tossed it at Sarah, hitting her square in the chest. "Here," he sneered into the mic, "since you love cleaning up my messes so much, take this. It's your severance package." The crowd gasped, but Julian wasn't done. He reached into his pocket, balled up a $10 bill, and threw it at her feet like she was a beggar. "And take this for the bus. My drivers are for family only, and as of this second, you are nothing. Get out of my tower before you ruin the view." Before we watch Julian eat those words in the most satisfying way possible, hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments, what is the best way to handle a bully? Do you scream back, or do you destroy them with silence? And wait, before I continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The cameras zoomed in on Sarah's face, expecting tears. They expected her to run away crying. But Sarah didn't move. She looked at the dirty rag on her chest, then down at the crumpled money. She didn't look broken. She looked bored. She bent down, picked up the $10 bill, and looked Julian in the eyes. The fear he expected to see wasn't there. Instead, there was a cold, terrifying emptiness. She spoke softly, but the microphone picked it up perfectly. "You're right, Julian," she said. "I should leave with exactly what I brought into this marriage." She reached into her purse. Julian laughed, asking if she was looking for a coupon. But she pulled out a heavy, matte black satellite phone with no brand name. It looked like military hardware. She pressed a single button. "Calling for a ride?" Julian mocked her. "Does your mother have gas money for her truck?" Sarah ignored him. She held the phone to her ear and spoke a sentence that made the air in the room turn ice cold. "Initiate Protocol 0. Come and get me." She hung up and checked her cheap plastic watch. "You have 15 minutes, Julian. Enjoy them. They are your last." Julian scoffed. 15 minutes until what? Until the bus arrives? 15 minutes, she whispered, until the lease on your life expires. She walked to the window and waited. Julian followed her, eager to laugh at her cheap ride. But exactly 15 minutes later, the laughter died in his throat. The ground began to shake. The champagne glasses rattled on the tables. Down on the avenue, the police were clearing the road. And turning the corner, blocking the entire street, was a convoy of 20 armored Rolls-Royce Phantoms, flying a flag that made the richest men in the room drop to their knees in terror. The Queen had called the cavalry, and Julian was standing in the crosshairs. "Mr. James here. We have the hook set deep. Now, we need to reel them in." The audience is waiting to see Julian's face crack when he realizes those cars aren't for a foreign dignitary. They are for the woman he just tipped $10. The vibration in the floor wasn't stopping. It was getting stronger. Inside the Thorne Tower penthouse, the crystal chandeliers began to sway, chiming softly against each other like warning bells. Julian laughed nervously, shouting to his guests that it was probably just heavy construction equipment passing by. After all, this was a city that never slept. He tried to turn the attention back to himself, back to his supermodel mistress, back to his moment of glory. But nobody was looking at Julian anymore. 300 pairs of eyes were glued to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The guests crowded the glass, peering down 50 stories to the avenue below. What they saw made the blood drain from their faces. The street, usually clogged with yellow taxis and impatient commuters, was eerily empty. Police motorcycles had blocked off 4 city blocks, creating a vacuum of silence in the heart of the metropolis. Then, the convoy entered the vacuum. It moved with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. One by one, the vehicles turned onto the main concourse. These were not the rental limos Julian used for his parties. These were armored beasts, Rolls-Royce Phantoms, lengthened and reinforced with ballistic steel, painted a midnight blue so dark it looked like a bruise on the city streets. There were 20 of them, a line of wealth and power so excessive it felt like an invasion. Julian pushed through the crowd, annoyed that his guests were ignoring him. He looked down and scoffed, trying to salvage his ego. He loudly speculated that the president must be in town, or perhaps a Saudi prince was coming to admire his new building. He joked that even foreign royalty knew that Thorn Tower was the place to be. He turned to Sarah, who was still standing by the window, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. He sneered, asking if she had planned her little exit to coincide with a parade. He told her she was lucky, that she could slip out the back door while everyone was distracted by the real VIPs. Sarah didn't even blink. She watched the lead car come to a halt directly in front of the red carpet entrance. She spoke to the glass, her voice barely a whisper, saying that royalty had indeed arrived, but not the kind Julian was used to. Down below, the doors of the lead vehicles didn't open immediately. A team of security detail spilled out first, men in tactical suits, not tuxedos. They secured the perimeter with a terrifying efficiency. They pushed Julian's personal security guards aside, as if they were children. Julian's smile faltered. He saw the flag fluttering on the hood of the lead car. It wasn't a national flag. It was a crest, a black shield with a silver falcon holding a key. A hush fell over the room. The bank chairman, a man who controlled half the city's debt, recognized the symbol. He dropped his champagne flute. It shattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the silent room. He whispered a name that made the people around him take a step back in fear. He whispered, "The Syndicate." Julian, oblivious and arrogant to the bitter end, frowned. He asked who the syndicate was and why they were parking in his driveway. Sarah finally turned to him. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just looked at him with a pity that was far worse than hatred. She told him that he was about to find out exactly who signed his paychecks. The doors to the grand hall swung open with a violence that made the guests jump. Julian spun around, ready to yell at whoever was interrupting his party, but the words died in his throat. Walking through the doors wasn't a hotel manager or a confused guest. It was the mayor of the city. And walking right beside him was the CEO of Global Steel, the man who supplied the beams for every skyscraper Julian had ever built. Behind them walked the chief of police, hat in hand, looking nervous. Julian's confusion turned into a manic excitement. He adjusted his tie, assuming they were here to surprise him, to honor his achievement. He spread his arms wide, stepping forward with his billionaire smile plastered on his face. He called out to the mayor, welcoming him to the party of the century, loudly joking that he didn't know the city officials were going to make such a grand entrance. He reached out to shake the mayor's hand. The mayor didn't even slow down. He walked right past Julian, as if he were a ghost. The CEO of Global Steel didn't even look at him. He brushed past Julian's shoulder, knocking him off balance. Julian stumbled, stunned. He watched as the most powerful men in the city formed 2 lines, creating a human corridor leading straight to the woman standing by the window, the woman holding a dirty microfiber rag and a $10 bill. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Sarah stood motionless. The Mao's demeanor was gone. Her posture was regal, her chin lifted high. The CEO of Global Steel, a man known for crushing unions and bullying senators, walked up to Sarah. He didn't shake her hand. He bowed. It was a deep, respectful bow from the waist. He spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. He apologized for the delay, addressing her not as Sarah, but as Madam President. He told her the extraction team was ready and the aircraft was on standby. Julian felt like the world was tilting sideways. He stammered, asking what was going on. He asked why they were bowing to his wife, the woman who used coupons at the grocery store. The mayor turned slowly to Julian, looking at him with pure disgust. He told Julian to be silent. He said that in this room, only one person had the authority to speak, and it certainly wasn't the man with the mortgage. Sarah handed the dirty rag to the police chief, who took it as if it were a sacred artifact. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She walked past the supermodel, Vanessa, who had shrunk back into the VIP booth, terrified. Sarah stopped in front of Julian. She looked at the expensive tuxedo he was so proud of. She told him that he looked good, but it was a shame that the suit was leased. Julian tried to laugh, tried to regain control. He asked if this was a prank, if she had hired actors. The CEO of Global Steel stepped in between them, his face hard as stone. He informed Julian that the Blackwood Syndicate did not hire actors. They hired governments. And right now, they were initiating a recall on a very bad investment. Julian stood paralyzed as the reality of the situation began to fracture his mind. The woman he had bullied for a decade, the woman he had forced to budget for groceries while he bought sports cars, was currently receiving a security briefing from the chief of police in the middle of his ballroom. He couldn't process it. He grabbed Sarah's arm, a mistake that nearly cost him his hand. Two tactical officers moved instantly, weapons drawn, but Sarah held up a hand to stop them. She looked at Julian's hand on her arm until he let go, trembling. He asked her who she really was. He asked her why she had lied to him for 10 years. Sarah finally broke her silence. She told him that she hadn't lied. She had omitted. She explained that she was Serafina Blackwood, the sole heiress to the Blackwood banking dynasty. She told him that 10 years ago, she wanted to know if a man could love her for herself, not for the empire she would one day inherit. So, she became Sarah. She became simple. She hid the billions to find something real. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a knife. She told him that she had found her answer tonight. She learned that without her money, he saw her as nothing. And so, she was taking the money back. Julian tried to pivot. He tried to charm her, his survival instinct kicking in. He smiled weakly, saying that they could talk about this, that he was just stressed, that the divorce talk was just a joke to spice up the party. Serafina didn't argue. She simply nodded to the mayor. "Revoke the occupancy permit for this building," she said calmly. "It doesn't meet my safety standards." The mayor nodded immediately, pulling out his phone. "It's done, Madam Blackwood. The building is condemned effective immediately." Julian screamed. He shouted that she couldn't do this, that this tower was his legacy. Serafina turned her back on him. She walked through the corridor of bowing elites, straight toward the elevator. Over her shoulder, she delivered the final blow of the night. She told him that he had mentioned earlier that she was good at cleaning. She suggested he start practicing, because by tomorrow morning, he wouldn't be able to afford a maid. She stepped into the elevator, and the doors slid shut, severing the connection between them forever. Julian was left standing in the center of the room, alone. The guests began to scatter, terrified of being associated with him. He pulled out his phone to call his lawyer, his hands shaking so hard he could barely type. But before he could dial, a notification popped up on his screen. It wasn't a text message. It was an alert from his bank. Alert. All accounts associated with Thorn Industries have been frozen by the creditor. He swiped to the next notification. Alert. Credit cards declined. He swiped again. Alert. Asset seizure team dispatched. Julian looked up from his phone, his face pale. The elevator had gone down, taking his wife and his future with it. The engines of the Rolls-Royces roared to life outside, a sound of raw power leaving the scene. Julian Thorn wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was just a man in a rented tuxedo, standing in a condemned building, holding a phone that no longer worked. "Mr. James here. We are entering phase 2, the deep dive. Now that the shock of the limousines is over, the audience wants to see the consequences. They want to see the gears of the Blackwood machine crushing Julian's life. We need to slow down slightly to savor the details of his panic, but keep the tension high." The ballroom of the Thorn Tower emptied faster than a sinking ship. 10 minutes ago, people were fighting to get a selfie with Julian. Now, they were practically sprinting to the elevators, terrified that if they stayed too long, the Blackwood Syndicate might think they were friends with him. Julian stood alone in the center of the debris. The floor was sticky with spilled champagne. The orchestra had packed up and left without asking for their check. They knew it would bounce. Julian, still clutching his frozen phone, tried to force a laugh. He looked at the empty room and shouted that they were all idiots, that this was just a misunderstanding, a lover's quarrel that had gotten out of hand. But his voice just echoed off the marble walls, hollow and pathetic. He needed to do damage control. He ran to his private office on the mezzanine level, slamming the door and locking it. This was his sanctuary, a soundproof room where he made his shadiest deals. He sat in his leather chair, trembling, and dialed the one number he saved for emergencies. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a man known simply as the Fixer, a guy who made problems and people disappear. Julian waited as the line rang. He wiped sweat from his forehead, telling himself that the Fixer could find dirt on Serafina Blackwood. Maybe she had a scandal. Maybe she was bluffing. If he could blackmail her, he could get his leverage back. The line clicked open. Julian started talking immediately, his words spilling out in a rush. He ordered the Fixer to dig up everything on Serafina. He promised double the usual fee. He demanded a dossier by morning. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, the Fixer spoke, his voice low and devoid of the usual professional courtesy. He asked Julian if he was insane. He told Julian that the moment those limousines pulled up, every mercenary, private investigator, and hacker in the city received a do-not-touch order. Julian screamed into the phone, offering triple the money. The Fixer laughed, a cold, sharp sound. He told Julian that money was useless if you were dead. He explained that the Blackwood Syndicate didn't just own banks. They owned the information networks. He told Julian that he was already deleting Julian's number from his phone and burning his files. The Fixer gave him one piece of free advice before he hung up forever. Run. The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone. For the first time, the magnitude of his mistake truly hit him. He hadn't just insulted his wife. He had declared war on a superpower. He tried to log into his offshore bank accounts, the secret ones he kept hidden from the tax authorities. Access denied. He tried his crypto wallet. Locked. He tried to check his stock portfolio. The screen flashed red. Trading suspended pending investigation. In the silence of his office, Julian heard a sound that made his stomach turn. It was the sound of the cleaning crew. They were moving through the ballroom, vacuuming the confetti. He realized with a sick, sinking feeling that the cleaning lady out there had more job security than he did. He poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter, his hand shaking so badly the scotch spilled over the rim. He drank it in one gulp, completely unaware that by sunrise, even this office would be taken from him. The sun rose over the city, casting a golden light on the skyline. But for Julian Thorne, it was the beginning of a nightmare. He hadn't slept. He had paced his office floor for 6 hours, watching the news channels loop the footage of his humiliation. The headline, "Billionaire Bullied by Secret Heiress," was trending globally. The comments section wasn't kind. The world was laughing at him. He decided he needed to be seen working. He needed to project strength. If he could just get to his flagship construction site, the Thorne Plaza, and show the investors that concrete was still being poured, he could calm the panic. He grabbed his keys and ran to the garage. His Ferrari didn't start. The dashboard flashed a message, lease terminated. Ignition disabled. He cursed, kicking the tire, and had to take a taxi, a yellow cab that smelled of stale coffee. The driver recognized him from the news and smirked in the rearview mirror the entire ride. When Julian arrived at the Thorne Plaza construction site, he expected the roar of jackhammers and the shouting of foremen. Instead, he was greeted by silence. It was a ghost town. The massive cranes stood still against the sky like dead metal skeletons. The cement mixers were turned off. Julian ran onto the site, his expensive shoes getting muddy. He found the site manager packing up his equipment into a truck. Julian grabbed him by the vest, demanding to know why the crew wasn't working. The manager shook him off, looking at Julian with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. He pointed to the steel beams that formed the skeleton of the building. He asked Julian to look closely at the stamp on the metal. Julian looked. Stamped into the red steel was a logo he had seen 1,000 times, but never really read: Blackwood Steel Corp. The manager explained the situation simply. The supplier had called at 4 a.m. They recalled the steel. All of it. They claimed it was defective, but everyone knew the truth. Without steel, there was no building. And without a building, the bank loans were in default. The manager spat on the ground near Julian's feet and told him that the union had pulled the workers, too. Nobody wanted to work for a dead man. Julian stood in the mud, surrounded by the unfinished monument to his ego. His phone buzzed. It was a notification from his secretary. She had resigned via text message. He needed cash. He needed to pay someone, anyone, to get the machines moving. He sprinted out of the construction site and ran 2 blocks to his main bank branch, the bank where he was a platinum client. He burst through the revolving doors, disheveled and frantic. He marched up to the teller, demanding to see the branch manager immediately. He slammed his hand on the counter, shouting that there had been a mistake with his accounts. The teller didn't flinch. She pressed a silent alarm button under the desk. The branch manager, a man Julian had played golf with last week, walked out of his glass office. He didn't invite Julian in. He stood in the lobby, arms crossed. He told Julian that there was no mistake. He informed Julian that the bank had invoked the character clause in his business loans. Due to the public nature of his scandal and the sudden drop in his stock value, the bank was calling in all debts. Immediately, Julian laughed hysterically. He told the manager he had 30 days to pay. The manager shook his head. He pulled out a document Julian had signed without reading years ago. He pointed to the fine print. It said that if the borrower's reputation caused material damage to the bank's image, the debt was due instantly. 2 security guards, large men who looked like they enjoyed their job, stepped up behind Julian. The manager asked Julian to leave the premises, or he would be removed for trespassing. Julian was escorted out onto the sidewalk like a common drunk. Passers-by stopped to take photos. He covered his face, but it was too late. The king of real estate was officially a vagrant. Defeated, humiliated, and mud-stained, Julian just wanted to go home. He wanted to lock the door of his penthouse, take a hot shower, and sleep until this nightmare ended. He convinced himself that as long as he had his home, his $10 million fortress in the sky, he could survive. He could sell the art. He could sell the furniture. He could rebuild. He took the elevator up to the penthouse of the Thorn Tower, the very building he had been kicked out of the night before. He told himself that legally, they couldn't evict him without a court order. It took months to evict a tenant in this city. He knew that. He had evicted enough people himself to know the timeline. He reached the penthouse door. He pulled out his gold-plated key card and swiped it. Beep, beep, beep. Red light. He frowned and swiped it again. Red light. He banged on the door, shouting for his house staff to open up. No answer. The house was silent. Behind him, the elevator dinged. Julian turned around, expecting Sarah to be there to gloat. But it wasn't Sarah. It was a team of 4 men in dark suits, holding clipboards. Leading them was the head of building security, a man named Marcus whom Julian had hired personally 5 years ago. Julian sighed with relief. He ordered Marcus to override the lock, telling him the key card system was glitching. Marcus didn't move. He looked at Julian with a blank expression. He told Julian that the lock wasn't glitching. The code had been changed. Julian's relief turned to rage. He reminded Marcus that he owned the penthouse. He screamed that he was the landlord. One of the men in suits stepped forward. He introduced himself as the legal counsel for the Vancroft Land Trust. He adjusted his glasses and corrected Julian. He explained that while Julian owned the structure of the penthouse, the land rights and the air rights of the tower were leased from the trust. Julian blinked. He vaguely remembered the lease deal. It was a way to save money on taxes years ago. The lawyer continued. He stated that the lease agreement contained a strict morality and conduct clause. It stated that if the tenant engaged in behavior that brought public shame or disrepute to the property, the lease was voided instantly. Julian gasped. He argued that a divorce wasn't a crime. The lawyer held up a tablet. On the screen was the video of Julian throwing the dirty rag at Sarah. The lawyer said that turning the property into a stage for abuse was a violation of Section 4, Paragraph B. The lease is terminated, the lawyer said coldly. You are trespassing. Marcus, the security guard Julian had treated like a servant for years, stepped forward. He was holding a cardboard box. He shoved it into Julian's chest. We packed for you, Marcus said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. We put in your toiletries and 1 change of clothes. Everything else, the art, the watches, the electronics, is being held as collateral for the unpaid ground rent. Julian looked at the small box. It was pathetic. He looked at Marcus and demanded 10 minutes. He begged for just 10 minutes to go inside and get his safe. Marcus checked his watch, mimicking exactly what Sarah had done the night before. He looked at Julian and shook his head. He said, "You don't have 10 minutes. You have 0 minutes. Escort him out." The other guards grabbed Julian by the arms. He struggled, shouting that he was a billionaire, that he would sue them all. They dragged him back into the elevator. The ride down was silent. Julian watched the numbers count down, 50, 40, 30. Each floor representing a layer of his life being stripped away. When the doors opened at the lobby, they didn't walk him out the front door. That would be too dignified. They walked him to the service entrance, the back door near the dumpster where the garbage trucks loaded. Marcus shoved him out into the alleyway. Julian stumbled, dropping his box. His toothbrush and a single pair of socks spilled onto the wet pavement. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him. The sound was final. Julian Thorne stood in the alley, smelling the garbage of the restaurant next door. He looked up at the towering skyscraper he used to call his own. It gleamed in the sunlight, unreachable. He reached into his pocket. He had no wallet, no keys, no cards. All he had was the crumpled $10 bill Sarah had left on the stage, which he had pocketed in a daze the night before. He looked at the money. It was all he had left in the world, and it wasn't even enough for a cab to the airport. Julian sat on a damp bench in a public park, clutching his cardboard box like a lifeline. He was hungry, he was tired, and his expensive suit was starting to wrinkle in the humid city air. But amidst the ruin, his mind latched onto one last hope, Vanessa. He convinced himself that she loved him. She hadn't been with him for the money, he reasoned. They had a connection. She was a supermodel. She had her own money. Surely, she would take him in. She would let him stay at her condo until he got back on his feet. They could be a power couple fighting against the world. He used the last 2% of his phone battery to call her. It went straight to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He remembered her schedule. She had a photo shoot today at the Pier Studios. Desperate, he spent 5 of his precious $10 on a subway ticket, a mode of transport he hadn't used in 15 years, and traveled to the studio. When he arrived, the security guard at the gate blocked him. Julian tried to pull the "Do you know who I am?" card, but the guard just looked at his mud-stained shoes and laughed. Julian waited by the exit for 3 hours in the scorching sun. Finally, the gates opened. A sleek, red convertible pulled out. Vanessa was in the passenger seat, laughing, her hair blowing in the wind. She looked radiant, completely unbothered by the fact that her fiancé was front-page news for all the wrong reasons. Julian ran into the road, waving his arms. The car screeched to a halt to avoid hitting him. Vanessa looked over her sunglasses, not with concern, but with annoyance. Julian rushed to her side of the car, breathless. He begged her to let him in. He told her about the frozen accounts, the eviction, the conspiracy. He promised her that once he sued Sarah, he would be twice as rich. He pleaded with her to just give him a place to sleep for the night. Vanessa didn't unlock the door. She looked him up and down, curling her lip in disgust. She asked him if he really thought she was going to date a homeless man. She told him that her brand was about luxury and success. And frankly, Julian was damaging her aesthetic. Julian was stunned. He reminded her of the diamonds he bought her, the trips to emotional connection they shared. She laughed, a sound that was even colder than Sarah's voice had been. She told him the diamonds were nice, but she had already pawned them this morning to distance herself from his scandal. Then, the driver of the car leaned over. Julian froze. It was Derek Vance, Julian's biggest rival in the real estate market. Derek grinned, showing off pearly white teeth. He told Julian that he shouldn't worry. Vanessa was in good hands now. Derek mentioned that he had just bought the lease on the Thorn Tower site and planned to rename it Vance Heights. Vanessa patted Derek's arm affectionately. She looked at Julian one last time and gave him a piece of advice. She heard the shelter on 5th Street had a decent soup kitchen. The car sped off, kicking dust into Julian's face. He stood there, coughing, watching the red taillights fade into the distance. The woman he had humiliated his wife for had replaced him in less than 24 hours. He was truly alone. While Julian was choking on dust in the street, Sarah, or rather, Serafina Blackwood, was sitting in a room that felt like the cockpit of a spaceship. She was 60 floors up in the Blackwood Citadel, a building that didn't appear on most tourist maps. The walls were lined with screens displaying global financial data in real time. She sat at the head of a long obsidian table. Around her sat the shadow board, 12 individuals who controlled the flow of resources for the entire continent. She wasn't wearing the gray suit anymore. She wore a tailored white blazer that cost more than Julian's Ferrari. Her hair was slicked back, her expression sharp and focused. There was no trace of the meek housewife. That character had been retired permanently. The board was reviewing the Thorn liquidation. A man in a sharp blue suit, her chief financial officer, presented the data. He reported that Julian's assets had been successfully frozen. The construction sites were secured. The media narrative was firmly under their control. Serafina nodded, sipping sparkling water. She asked about the collateral damage. She wanted to make sure the innocent workers on Julian's sites were paid. She ordered the CFO to issue severance checks to all of Julian's employees out of the Blackwood Emergency Fund. She wouldn't let working families suffer for Julian's arrogance. Then, the mood in the room shifted. The head of forensic accounting, a woman with glasses and a severe haircut, cleared her throat. She slid a thick black folder across the table to Serafina. She told Serafina that while seizing Julian's servers, they had found something disturbing. They had been looking for hidden assets, but they found something much worse. Serafina opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the documents. It was a series of wire transfers. The accountant explained that Julian hadn't just been spending his own money. For the last 3 years, he had been quietly siphoning funds from the Sarah's Hope charity, the small nonprofit Sarah had started to help orphans. Julian had been listed as the treasurer. He had treated the charity like his personal piggy bank, using donations meant for starving children to pay for Vanessa's jewelry and his gambling debts. The room went deadly silent. The board members looked at Serafina, waiting for the explosion. Stealing from a bank was one thing. Stealing from orphans was a death sentence in their world. Serafina didn't yell. She closed the folder slowly. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it burned. She had tolerated his insults. She had tolerated his infidelity. But this was a violation of the only thing she truly cared about. She looked up at the board. Her eyes were hard as diamonds. She told them that the plan had changed. She said that originally, she just wanted to leave him broke. But now she wanted him buried. She turned to her chief legal counsel. She asked if the evidence was solid. The counsel nodded. It was airtight. It was federal wire fraud and embezzlement. 10 years in prison minimum. Serafina stood up. She ordered them to package the evidence and send it to the FBI. But she told them to wait exactly 2 hours. She wanted Julian to have one last moment of hope before the cage slammed shut. Julian knew he had one card left to play: public opinion. He couldn't fight Sarah in the boardroom, but maybe he could fight her in the living rooms of America. He was a narcissist, and narcissists always believe they can talk their way out of anything. He used the last of his change to make a collect call to a producer he knew, a man who ran a trashy, sensationalist talk show called The Real Truth. The producer, sensing a ratings goldmine, agreed to put Julian on air immediately. He even sent a car to pick him up, a beat-up sedan, not a limo. An hour later, Julian sat under the hot studio lights. He had cleaned himself up in the station bathroom, but he still looked manic. His eyes were wide, his hair slightly disheveled. The Billionaire veneer was cracking. When the cameras rolled, Julian went on the attack. He looked straight into the lens and lied. He told the host that he was the victim. He spun a wild story about how Sarah was a masterful con artist who had tricked him into marriage to steal his company. He claimed the Blackwood Syndicate was an illegal mafia organization that was bullying an honest American businessman. He squeezed out fake tears. He talked about how much he loved his employees and how Sarah had heartlessly fired them, a lie, since Sarah had just paid them. He begged the public to help him. He asked for donations to his legal defense fund. The host ate it up, nodding sympathetically, flashing the donation number on the screen. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The live viewer poll showed a slight tick in Julian's favor. People love a conspiracy theory. Julian felt a surge of triumph. He thought he was winning. He thought he was turning the tide. He leaned forward, emboldened. He pointed a finger at the camera and addressed Sarah directly. He dared her to come out of the shadows. He challenged her to face him in open court if she had nothing to hide. He shouted that he wasn't afraid of her money. While he was shouting, he didn't notice the commotion happening behind the cameras. He didn't see the producer's face turn white. He didn't see the stage manager frantically pointing to the wings. Julian kept ranting, feeling powerful again. He called Sarah a thief. He called her a fraud. Then, the studio doors burst open. It wasn't a commercial break. It wasn't a surprise guest. 6 agents in windbreakers marked FBI stormed onto the set. The audience screamed. The host jumped out of his chair. Julian froze mid-sentence. He looked at the agents, confused. He thought maybe they were there to arrest Sarah based on his testimony. The lead agent walked right onto the stage, interrupting the live broadcast. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at Julian. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Julian stood up, stammering. He asked what this was. He asked who they were looking for. The agent grabbed Julian's wrist and spun him around, slamming him against the producer's desk. He spoke loud enough for the microphone to pick up every word. Julian Thorne, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, and money laundering. Julian screamed that it was a mistake, that he was innocent. The agent tightened the cuffs. We have the bank records, Mr. Thorne. We know about the orphanage money. The camera zoomed in on Julian's face as the color drained away. The victim narrative vanished in a second. The world wasn't watching a persecuted businessman anymore. They were watching a man who stole from children getting dragged away in chains. In the control booth, the producer didn't cut the feed. He kept it rolling. It was the highest-rated segment in the show's history. And somewhere in a high-rise tower, Serafina Blackwood watched the screen, took a sip of her water, and finally allowed herself a small, cold smile. The holding cell at the Federal Detention Center did not smell like the lavender-infused air of the Thorne Tower penthouse. It smelled of bleach, sweat, and bad decisions. Julian sat on a metal bench, his tuxedo shirt torn, his expensive shoes confiscated and replaced with orange rubber sandals. He had spent the night pacing the 6-by-8-foot cage, alternating between weeping and screaming that he was a victim of a conspiracy. By morning, the reality had set in. His friends weren't coming. His mistress had abandoned him. His bank accounts were frozen. But Julian Thorne had one quality that was harder to kill than a cockroach: his entitlement. He was convinced there had to be a way out. He just needed the right shark. When the guard finally buzzed the door open, it wasn't for an interrogation. It was for a visitor. Julian was led into a small, windowless room where a man was waiting. The man wasn't from a top-tier law firm. He wore a suit that was slightly too shiny and smelled of cheap cologne. He introduced himself as Arthur Vane, a lawyer who specialized in difficult cases, the kind reputable firms wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Vane didn't offer sympathy. He offered a strategy. He slid a piece of paper across the metal table. It was a copy of the marriage license Julian and Sarah had signed 10 years ago. Vane leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He explained that he had been watching the news. He saw the limousines. He saw the reveal of the Blackwood fortune. And while everyone else saw Julian as a criminal, Vane saw a jackpot. He pointed to a clause in the state's matrimonial law. It was called material non-disclosure. Vane explained that when two people marry, they are legally required to disclose their assets. If Sarah was secretly a billionaire heiress and she hid that fact from Julian for a decade, that was technically fraud. She had entered the marriage under false pretenses. Julian's eyes lit up. The color returned to his cheeks. He asked if that meant the marriage could be annulled. Vane laughed, shaking his head. He told Julian to think bigger. He explained that if they sued for spousal fraud, they weren't just asking for an annulment. They could argue that Julian had made financial decisions based on a false reality. They could sue for damages. And since Sarah was worth billions, damages could look like 50% of her empire. Julian sat back, a slow, twisted smile spreading across his face. He realized the irony. Sarah's secret, the very thing she used to destroy him, could be the weapon he used to rob her. He convinced himself that he deserved it. After all, wasn't he the victim here? Wasn't he the one who had been lied to? He authorized Vane to file the lawsuit immediately. He didn't have money to pay the retainer, but Vane waved it off, agreeing to work on a contingency basis. Vane was hungry, and he smelled blood in the water. As Julian was led back to his cell to await his bail hearing, he didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. He felt like a predator lying in wait. He muttered to himself that Sarah thought she had won the war with her limousines, but she had forgotten one thing. In America, you don't need an army to destroy someone. You just need a loophole. 48 hours later, Julian was released on bail. The bond was posted by a mysterious shell company connected to Arthur Vane, an investment in the upcoming lawsuit. Julian walked out of the detention center not with his head down, but with his chin up. The cameras were waiting. He didn't run from them this time. He stopped on the courthouse steps. He looked into the lens of the nearest news camera and delivered a message directly to his wife. He announced that he was countersuing. He declared that Serafina Blackwood was a fraudster who had trapped him in a deceitful union. He promised that he would take half of everything she owned, right down to the tires on her Rolls Royces. Across town, in the quiet, sunlit library of the Blackwood estate, Serafina watched the broadcast on a tablet. She was drinking tea, looking as serene as a calm sea before a hurricane. Her assistant, a young woman named Chloe, rushed into the room, looking pale. She held a thick envelope with red legal stamps. She told Serafina that a process server was at the gate. Julian had actually done it. He had served her with a lawsuit claiming emotional and financial damages due to marital fraud. Chloe asked if they should call the legal team. She asked if they should try to settle to keep it out of the press. Serafina set her teacup down gently. She took the envelope from Chloe's shaking hands. She didn't open it. She didn't read the accusations. She stood up and walked over to the large stone fireplace where a fire was crackling. She looked at the fire, then at the envelope. She told Chloe that Julian was making a classic mistake. He assumed that because she had been quiet for 10 years, she was afraid of noise. He didn't understand that she had stayed quiet to protect him, not herself. She tossed the lawsuit into the fire. Chloe gasped, asking what she was doing. Serafina watched the paper curl and blacken in the flames. She turned to her assistant with a cold smile. She explained that she wasn't destroying the lawsuit to avoid it. She was accepting the challenge. She wanted him to take this to court. She wanted him to stand in front of a judge and argue that he deserved half her money because he didn't know she was rich enough to tolerate his abuse. "Let him come," Serafina whispered. "He thinks the courtroom is his battleground because he can talk. He forgets that a courtroom is a place of record." She instructed Chloe to call the senior partner at their law firm. But her order wasn't to build a defense. Her order was to prepare the Omega File, a collection of documents Serafina had been compiling for a decade. Every receipt, every recorded conversation, every email Julian had ever sent. "He wants to sue for fraud?" she asked the empty room. "I'll show him what a fraud really looks like." Back in his cheap motel room, Julian was celebrating prematurely. He and Vane were drinking cheap whiskey, toasting to their brilliance. They were drafting a list of assets they planned to seize: the private jets, the island in the Caribbean, the limousines. Julian was drunk on the idea of revenge. He didn't know that by filing that lawsuit, he hadn't fired a cannon at the castle. He had just locked himself inside the cage with the lion. The euphoria of the lawsuit didn't last long. The next morning, reality hit Julian like a freight train. Lawsuits, even ones taken on contingency, have costs. There were filing fees, administrative costs, and bribes that Vane needed to grease the wheels. Vane demanded $5,000 in cash by noon to keep the case moving. Julian checked his wallet. He had the $10 bill Sarah had given him, and maybe $40 in loose change he had scrounged up. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it now. He remembered his watch. On his wrist was a Patek Philippe Nautilus, a timepiece he had bought 3 years ago for $80,000. It was his pride and joy, the ultimate symbol of his status. He figured he could pawn it for at least 50 grand quick cash. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt up. He was wearing clothes donated by the lawyer, and walked to a high-end pawn shop in the Diamond District. He tried to look confident as he slapped the watch onto the glass counter. He told the broker he wanted $40,000, cash, no questions asked. The broker, an elderly man with a jeweler's loupe, picked up the watch. He examined it for less than 10 seconds. He put the loupe down and looked at Julian with a bored expression. He offered Julian $200. Julian exploded. He shouted that the watch was a Patek Philippe, worth more than the broker's entire life. He accused the man of trying to rip him off. The broker sighed and turned the watch over. He pointed to a microscopic engraving on the back of the casing. It didn't say Swiss made. It said replica grade A. The broker explained that this was a very high-quality fake, likely worth $500 new, but it was definitely not gold, and it definitely wasn't real. Julian froze. He flashed back to 3 years ago. He remembered giving the money to his personal shopper to buy the watch. He realized with a sick jolt that everyone in his life, his shopper, his friends, his staff, had been ripping him off for years because they knew he was too arrogant to check the details. He had been walking around with a fake watch, living a fake life. He snatched the watch back and stormed out of the shop, his face burning with shame. He tried to sell his cufflinks next. Fake. He tried to sell his gold pen. Plated brass. By noon, Julian had managed to scrape together exactly $15 by selling his designer sunglasses to a teenager on the street. It wasn't enough for the lawyer. It wasn't even enough for a taxi back to the motel. He stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue, the same street where the Limousines had humiliated him days earlier. It started to rain, a cold, gray drizzle that soaked through his thin sweatshirt. He looked down the street. A yellow taxi approached, its vacant light on. Julian raised his hand instinctively. The driver slowed down, looked at Julian's wet, desperate appearance, and sped up, splashing a puddle of dirty water onto his legs. Julian stood there, dripping wet, shivering. He looked at the $15 in his hand. Then, he heard the screech of brakes. A massive, hulking vehicle pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a Rolls-Royce. It was the M15 city bus. The doors hissed open. The driver, a tired-looking woman, stared at him. "You getting on or what?" Julian looked at the bus. He remembered his own voice from the gala. "Take the bus. Get out of my tower." The words echoed in his head, mocking him. He swallowed his pride, which tasted like bile. He stepped onto the bus. He fed his crumpled bills into the machine. He walked down the aisle, avoiding the eyes of the other passengers, and sat in the back, squeezed between a crying baby and a man who smelled like onions. As the bus lurched forward, Julian rested his forehead against the cold, greasy window. He watched the city pass by, the city he thought he owned. He was finally living the life he had tried to force on Sarah. And the worst part? The lawsuit was his only way off this bus, and he couldn't even afford the ticket to ride. Julian got off the bus 3 miles from the city center in the wealthy suburb of Silver Creek. He wasn't there to sightsee. He was there to play his last card. He knew he couldn't afford Arthur Vane's fees with pocket change, but he had friends here. He had spent the last decade drinking scotch with the city's elite, golfing with senators, and partying with hedge fund managers. Surely, one of them would lend him 50 grand for old times' sake. He walked up the long, manicured driveway of the Royal Oaks Country Club. This was his sanctuary. He had been a member here for 8 years. He knew the valet, the bartender, and the doorman by name. He straightened his donated suit, slicked back his hair with water from a puddle, and marched toward the entrance. He expected a warm welcome. He expected the valet, Thomas, to rush over and ask where his Ferrari was. But Thomas didn't move. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at Julian like he was a trespasser. Julian tried to breeze past him, flashing his signature smile. He said he was just there to see Brad, the club president. Thomas stepped in front of him, blocking the path. He didn't say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne." He said, "Members only." Julian laughed, a brittle sound. He reminded Thomas that he was a member. He claimed he paid his dues annually. Thomas shook his head slowly. He informed Julian that his membership had been revoked yesterday afternoon via an emergency board vote. The reason cited was conduct unbecoming of a gentleman. Julian felt his face heat up. He shouted that they couldn't do this. He spotted Brad, his best friend, the man Julian had taken to Vegas for his bachelor party, walking across the putting green. Julian screamed his name, waving his arms. Brad looked up. He saw Julian standing at the gate, looking desperate and disheveled. Brad didn't wave back. He didn't come over. He turned his back, said something to the other golfers, and they all laughed. They walked away, leaving Julian screaming at a chain-link fence. Desperate, Julian pulled out his phone and dialed the number of another friend, a tech CEO named Mike. Mike answered on the first ring, sounding annoyed. Julian begged. He didn't ask for a loan. He asked for an investment. He pitched the lawsuit against Sarah as a sure thing. He promised Mike a 300% return once he won the settlement. Mike cut him off. His voice was low and serious. He told Julian to stop calling. He explained that 10 minutes ago, every member of the club received a memo from the Blackwood Bank. The memo stated that any individual or entity providing financial aid to Julian Thorne would have their credit lines reviewed for risk. "Do you understand, Julian?" Mike hissed. "Nobody is going to help you. If we give you $1, Serafina Blackwood cuts off our millions. You're not just broke, you're radioactive." The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone. He looked through the fence at the lush green golf course, a world he was now barred from forever. He realized then that he never really had friends. He just had people who tolerated him while the drinks were free. Now that the tab was due, the bar was closed. Night had fallen, and with it, the temperature dropped. Julian had walked 6 miles back toward the city limits, his feet blistered in his cheap shoes. He couldn't afford a hotel. He couldn't even afford a hostel. He ended up at the Starlight Motor Inn, a decaying roadside motel next to a highway overpass. The neon sign buzzed ominously, the letter S flickering on and off. The clerk, a man behind bulletproof glass, took Julian's last crumpled bills and tossed a key onto the counter without looking up. Room 104 was a box of misery. The carpet was sticky. The wallpaper was peeling. There was a distinct smell of mold and old cigarettes. Julian sat on the sagging mattress, listening to the roar of trucks passing on the highway above. He was the king of real estate, sitting in a room that would fail a safety inspection in a third-world country. He was starving. He found a half-empty vending machine in the hallway and used his loose change to buy a bag of stale pretzels. He sat on the bed, eating the dry, salty snacks, tears finally streaming down his face. He picked up the remote control, which was taped together, and turned on the small television bolted to the wall. He just wanted some noise to drown out his thoughts. But the universe wasn't done punishing him. The news was on. And there, filling the screen, was Sarah. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hiding. She was standing at a podium in front of the Thorn Tower. But the gold Thorn sign was gone. In its place, a team of workers was hoisting a new sign, the Blackwood Sanctuary. The news anchor's voice was full of admiration. She reported that Serafina Blackwood had just donated the entire skyscraper to the city. It wouldn't be luxury condos anymore. It would be a state-of-the-art facility for victims of domestic and financial abuse. The camera zoomed in on Sarah. She looked radiant, powerful, angelic. She spoke into the microphones, saying that for too long, this building had been a monument to ego. Now, it would be a monument to hope. She said she knew what it was like to be silenced, and she was making sure no one else would have to suffer in silence again. Julian threw the bag of pretzels at the TV. He screamed at the screen. He screamed that it was his tower, his legacy. But nobody heard him. The people on the screen clapped. The people in the motel room next door banged on the wall and told him to shut up. Julian collapsed back onto the bed. He looked at the water stain on the ceiling. He realized that Sarah hadn't just taken his money. She had taken his name. She had erased him. He curled up into a ball, shivering under the thin, scratchy blanket. He closed his eyes, praying for the morning to come. Because tomorrow was the trial. Tomorrow, he would have his day in court. Tomorrow, he told himself, the law would save him. He drifted into a fitful sleep, unaware that the law was exactly what Serafina was counting on. The morning of the trial was gray and rainy, matching the mood of the defendant. Julian met Arthur Vane outside the courthouse. Vane looked nervous. He was sweating, despite the cold. He told Julian that the judge assigned to the case was Judge Sterling, a man known for being harsh, fair, and utterly humorless. Vane tried to sound confident, straightening his cheap tie, but Julian could smell the fear on him. They walked up the steps. A crowd had gathered. Julian straightened his back, thinking the paparazzi were there for him. He prepared a statement in his head about justice and truth. But as he got closer, he realized the cameras weren't pointed at him. They were pointed at the convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the curb. Serafina stepped out. She didn't have a cheap lawyer. She was flanked by a team of 5 attorneys from Vancroft, Hale and Partners, the most expensive, ruthless law firm in the country. They moved in a phalanx around her, looking like sharks in Italian suits. Julian and Vane had to squeeze past them to get through the metal detectors. Vane looked at the opposing counsel and swallowed hard. He whispered to Julian that the lead attorney for Sarah was Marcus Hale, a man who hadn't lost a case in 20 years. Inside the courtroom, the disparity was even worse. Julian sat on the plaintiff's side with Vane. Their table was cluttered with messy papers and styrofoam coffee cups. On the defense side, Sarah sat perfectly still. Her team had organized their files into neat, color-coded binders. They had laptops, tablets, and a calm efficiency that was terrifying. Sarah didn't look at Julian. She looked at the judge's empty chair, waiting. The bailiff cried out, "All rise." Judge Sterling entered. He was an older man with a face carved from granite. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the two tables. His gaze lingered on Vane's messy pile of papers with a hint of distaste. "We are here for the matter of Thorne versus Blackwood," the judge boomed. "The plaintiff alleges marital fraud. Mr. Vane, you may present your opening statement." Arthur Vane stood up. His hands were shaking. He walked to the center of the room. He began his speech, stuttering slightly. He painted Julian as a simple, hard-working man who had been duped by a manipulative woman. He used words like betrayal and emotional distress. It was a rehearsed, theatrical performance, but Vane was sweating through his shirt. Julian nodded along, feeling vindicated. Yes, he thought. Tell them how she lied. Then, it was Marcus Hale's turn. Sarah's lawyer didn't walk to the center of the room. He stood at his table, buttoned his jacket, and spoke in a calm, bored voice. He told the judge that the defense would not be making a long speech. He said that the plaintiff's entire case rested on the idea that he was a victim. Hale paused. He looked directly at Julian. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We intend to prove," Hale said, "that Mr. Thorne is not a victim. He is a predator who simply picked the wrong prey. And we will prove that his lawsuit is not a quest for justice, but a continuation of the abuse he inflicted for a decade." Hale sat down. The room was silent. Julian felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He looked at Vane, expecting his lawyer to object, to fight back. But Vane was staring at his phone under the table. His face had gone pale white. He nudged Julian and whispered, "We have a problem." "What?" Julian hissed. "I just got an email," Vane whispered, his voice trembling. "The Bar Association is auditing my license. Effective immediately." Julian's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" "It means," Vane said, closing his briefcase with a snap, "that if I say one more word in this courtroom, I get disbarred. You're on your own, kid." Vane stood up. He looked at the judge and announced that he was withdrawing as counsel due to a sudden conflict of interest. Before Julian could grab him, Vane turned and practically ran out of the courtroom, leaving the door swinging behind him. Julian sat alone at the table. The judge looked down at him over his spectacles. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice echoing like doom, "it appears you are representing yourself. Are you ready to proceed?" Julian looked at Sarah. She finally turned her head and met his gaze. She raised one eyebrow, as if to say, "Your move." The courtroom doors closed, sealing Julian inside with his nightmare. He stood alone at the plaintiff's table, looking at the empty chair where his lawyer used to be. He adjusted his collar, sweating profusely. But Julian Thorne was a salesman at heart, and he convinced himself that he didn't need a lawyer. He was charming. He was persuasive. He could talk this judge into seeing things his way. He stood up and addressed Judge Sterling. He tried to turn on the charisma. He apologized for his lawyer's cowardice and claimed that the truth was simple. His wife had deceived him. The judge didn't smile. He stared at Julian over his spectacles and told him to sit down and be quiet. He turned to the defense table and asked Mr. Hale if he was ready to present his case. Marcus Hale, Sarah's shark of an attorney, stood up. He didn't hold a stack of papers. He held a single, small remote control. He told the court that the defense had only one exhibit to present. He pointed the remote at the large screen on the wall. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't the video of the gala. It was a spreadsheet. A complex, detailed bank ledger dating back 10 years. Hale began to speak, his voice calm and surgical. He walked the court through the numbers. He showed a transfer of $1 million labeled Angel Investment for Julian's first company. He asked Julian if he recognized the transfer. Julian nodded arrogantly. He said yes. That was the seed money from a private investor in Switzerland who believed in his vision. Hale clicked the remote. The screen zoomed in on the source of the funds. It wasn't a Swiss investor. The account name was the Vancroft Trust, S. Blackwood. Julian froze. He squinted at the screen. Hale clicked again. He showed the loan for the Thorne Tower land. Julian had always bragged that he negotiated a killer deal with the landowners. The screen showed the truth. The land was owned by Sarah, and she had leased it to him for $1 a year. Hale continued, relentless. He showed the credit card bills. He showed the car payments. He showed the mortgage on the penthouse. Every single major financial milestone in Julian's life, every win he had celebrated with champagne, had been quietly paid for by the woman he called a mouse. Hale turned to Julian, who was now gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. Hale delivered the killing blow. He told the court that Julian Thorne wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a tycoon. He was, effectively, an unemployed man living on a very generous allowance from his wife. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The journalists were typing furiously. Julian felt his world spinning. His entire identity, the self-made man, was a lie. He hadn't climbed the mountain. Sarah had carried him to the top while he complained about her weight. Julian jumped up. He screamed that it was fake. He shouted that the documents were doctored. Hale simply turned off the screen and looked at the judge. He stated that the defense rested. They didn't need to say anything else. The numbers had screamed loud enough. The silence that followed Hale's presentation was heavy, suffocating. Julian stood there, panting, his eyes darting around the room. He saw the pity in the eyes of the jury. He saw the disgust in the eyes of the judge. And worst of all, he saw the indifference in Sarah's eyes. She wasn't looking at him with anger. She was looking at him like he was a stranger. Something inside Julian snapped. The facade of the sophisticated businessman shattered completely. He slammed his fist onto the table. He pointed a shaking finger at Sarah. He started screaming. He didn't scream about the money anymore. He screamed the truth. He shouted that she should have told him. He shouted that she humiliated him by helping him. He yelled that he would rather be broke than owe her a dime. He called her names that made the stenographer flinch. He knocked over his chair. He was no longer the smooth operator in the tuxedo. He was a tantrum-throwing child who had had his toys taken away. Judge Sterling banged his gavel. Once, twice, 3 times. He ordered Julian to be silent. But Julian couldn't stop. He lunged toward the defense table, driven by a blind, animalistic rage. 2 bailiffs tackled him before he got halfway across the room. They pinned him to the floor, his face pressed against the cold tile. Order, the judge roared. Get him off the floor. The bailiffs hauled Julian up. He was disheveled, red-faced, and panting. The fight had gone out of him. He hung in their grip, limp and defeated. Judge Sterling looked down at him with pure contempt. He adjusted his robe and spoke into the microphone. He stated that he had seen enough. He didn't need to deliberate. He addressed the courtroom. He declared that the plaintiff's suit for marital fraud was not only dismissed but was deemed frivolous and malicious. He stated that the evidence clearly showed that Ms. Blackwood had been the sole financial support for the household. Then, the judge turned to the criminal charges, the embezzlement from the charity. He looked at the FBI agents standing in the back of the room. He said that based on the financial records presented today, the evidence of theft from the Sarah's Hope Foundation was irrefutable. Julian Thorne, the judge said, his voice echoing like the voice of God. You are a fraud. You are a thief. And you are a bully. I find you liable for all damages. I am stripping you of every remaining asset you may have hidden. You are bankrupt, sir, morally and financially. Julian slumped in the bailiff's arms. It was over. He was going to prison. He closed his eyes, waiting for the sentence, waiting for the years to be read out. But then, a voice cut through the room. Clear, calm, and commanding. Your Honor, if I may. It was Sarah. She had stood up. She walked to the center of the room. She looked at the judge, then at the broken man held by the guards. I have a request regarding the sentencing, she said. The judge paused. He looked at Sarah with respect. He nodded slowly. Go on, Ms. Blackwood. The courtroom held its breath. Everyone expected Sarah to ask for the maximum sentence. They expected her to want him locked away in a dark cell for 20 years. That's what a normal victim would want. But Serafina Blackwood played a longer game. She stood before the bench, her hands clasped. She spoke softly. She told the judge that sending Julian to prison would be too easy. In prison, he would be fed. He would have a bed. He would have a routine. He would be able to play the victim, telling his cellmates how his evil wife framed him. He would never learn. He would never change. She turned to look at Julian. He was watching her warily, confused. I don't want the state to pay for his life, Your Honor, Sarah said. And I don't want his money, because he has none. I want his labor. She pulled a document from her folder. She explained that under the Restitution Through Service Act, a victim of financial crime could petition the court to have the perpetrator work off their debt if they were indigent. She told the judge that she had recently acquired a new property, a large building in the city center that was being converted into a homeless shelter. It was a massive operation. It needed constant maintenance. It needed floors scrubbed. It needed toilets cleaned. It needed trash hauled. I need a sanitation specialist, Sarah said, her eyes locking onto Julian's. Minimum wage. All proceeds go directly to the charity he stole from. Julian gasped. He started to shake his head. No, he whispered. Send me to jail. Please. He realized what she was doing. Jail was anonymity. This was public humiliation every single day. She wanted him to clean the toilets of the very building he used to own. She wanted him to serve the people he used to look down on. The judge listened. A small, rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He looked at Julian, then back at Sarah. He asked if she was willing to supervise this arrangement. My team will supervise him, Sarah replied. Strictly. The judge nodded. He banged his gavel with a finality that shook the room. Mr. Thorne, the judge announced, I am suspending your prison sentence on the condition of a 5-year work program. You are hereby ordered to report to the Blackwood Sanctuary at 6 o'clock hours tomorrow morning. You will report to the head of maintenance. The judge leaned forward. And Mr. Thorne? If you miss one shift, if you break one rule, if you show up 1 minute late, you go straight to federal prison for 15 years. Do I make myself clear? Julian couldn't speak. He felt like he was suffocating. He nodded weakly. Good, the judge said. Court is adjourned. The bailiffs released him. Julian fell to his knees. He wasn't going to jail, but his life was over. He looked up and saw Sarah walking past him toward the exit. She didn't stop. She didn't look down. She just walked out into the flashing cameras, leaving him on the floor, exactly where he belonged. Julian walked out of the courthouse a free man, technically, but as he stood on the sidewalk, watching the tail lights of Sarah's limousine disappear into traffic, he realized he was in a prison without bars. He had no money. He had no home. He had no friends. And thanks to Judge Sterling, he had a schedule to keep. A young paralegal from Sarah's firm approached him. She didn't look at him with admiration. She looked at him like he was a task to be completed. She handed him a thick manila envelope. Your orientation packet, Mr. Thorne, she said briskly. The bus pass is inside. Do not lose it. We will not replace it. Julian took the envelope. It felt heavy. Inside was a contract for his new role as a sanitation specialist. The hourly rate was minimum wage. The location was 1 Thorne Plaza, now officially renamed the Sanctuary. He read the fine print. He wasn't allowed to use the main elevators. He wasn't allowed to use the guest restrooms. He had to take his lunch break in the basement utility room. It was a list of rules designed to strip away every ounce of his ego. He spent his final night of freedom back at the cheap motel, but he couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the uniform folded on the chair. It wasn't a tuxedo. It was a jumpsuit. A shapeless, navy blue polyester jumpsuit with a patch on the chest that read maintenance. He touched the fabric. It was rough and cheap. He thought about burning it. He thought about running away to Mexico. But he remembered the judge's voice. One mistake, and you go to federal prison for 15 years. He was trapped. The man who used to fire people for bringing him the wrong coffee was now terrifyingly afraid of being late for a shift he didn't want. At 4:30 a.m., his alarm went off. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, the sound of a workday starting before the sun came up. He showered in cold water because the motel boiler was broken. He put on the jumpsuit. It was tight in the shoulders and loose in the waist. He looked in the cracked mirror. The reflection staring back wasn't Julian Thorne, the titan of industry. It was just a tired, middle-aged man in a janitor's suit. He realized with a sick feeling that for the first time in his life, his outside appearance finally matched his inside reality. He grabbed his bus pass and walked out into the dark, cold morning. The service entrance of the sanctuary smelled of bleach and damp mop heads. Julian stood at the time clock, holding his punch card with trembling hands. He didn't know how to use it. He had installed these machines in his buildings, but he had never actually touched one. Insert and slide down, a gruff voice said behind him. Julian turned. It was the head of maintenance, a large man named Frank. Frank had worked in this building for 5 years. Julian had walked past him 1,000 times and never once learned his name. Now, Frank was his boss. You're late, Thorne, Frank grunted. It's 6:01. Don't let it happen again. Frank led him to the supply closet. It was a cramped room filled with buckets and chemicals. Frank pointed to a cart. Lobby duty. The floors need to be spotless before the shelter opens at 8 a.m. Frank reached to a shelf and tossed something at Julian. Julian caught it instinctively. He looked down at his hands. It was a yellow microfiber rag. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The gala. The stage. The moment he threw this exact type of rag at Sarah and told her to clean up his mess. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. Now, he was holding the rag, and the mess was his life. Get to work, Frank ordered. Julian pushed the heavy cart out into the lobby. The space was magnificent. The marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers. This was his lobby. He had picked out that marble in Italy. He had designed the lighting. He felt a ghost of his old pride until a group of people walked in. It wasn't shelter residents. It was his old executive staff, the VP of sales, the head of marketing, his former personal assistant. They had all been rehired by Sarah to run the charity. They stopped when they saw him. They saw the jumpsuit. They saw the mop bucket. They saw the man who used to scream at them for typos now preparing to scrub the floor they walked on. Julian wanted to die. He wanted to sink into the marble. He turned his back to them, pretending to inspect a scuff mark. "Is that Mr. Thorne?" someone whispered. "No." Another voice replied, cold and dismissive. "That's just the janitor. Come on, we have a meeting with the president." They walked past him. Their heels clicked on the floor. Julian squeezed the handle of the mop so hard his fingers cramped. He dropped the rag onto the floor, got down on his knees, and began to wipe. The cold stone seeped through his thin trousers. He scrubbed until his arm burned, trying to rub away the shame, but the stain was permanent. By noon, Julian was exhausted. His back screamed in protest. His hands were raw from the harsh chemicals. He was scrubbing a stain near the main reception desk when the automatic doors slid open. The air in the lobby changed. It wasn't just the cold wind from outside. It was a shift in energy. The chatter at the front desk stopped. The security guards straightened their posture. Julian looked up from his knees. Serafina Blackwood walked in. She was wearing a cream-colored business suit that radiated soft power. She wasn't surrounded by bodyguards this time. She walked with the confidence of a woman who owned every inch of the world she stepped on. She stopped in the center of the lobby, looking at the renovations. She nodded to the staff, smiling warmly. Then, her eyes drifted down. They locked onto Julian. He froze. He was on his hands and knees, holding a dirty rag. He was literally at her feet. The lobby went silent. Everyone watched. They expected her to kick him. They expected her to laugh. They expected her to do exactly what he had done to her. Sarah walked over to him. The sound of her heels stopped inches from his face. Julian couldn't look her in the eye. He stared at her expensive shoes. Shoes that cost more than he would make in 5 years of this job. "You missed a spot," she said softly. Julian flinched. He furiously scrubbed a clean patch of marble, desperate to please her, desperate to avoid the prison sentence. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I'll get it. I'll clean it." Sarah watched him for a moment. Her expression wasn't angry. It was almost sad. She saw the man who had terrified her for a decade reduced to a trembling wreck. She realized that he was never powerful. He was just loud. She reached into her purse. Julian stopped scrubbing. He watched her hand. She pulled out a crisp $10 bill. She let it drop. It fluttered through the air, drifting side to side, just like the bill he had thrown at her on the stage. It landed on the wet floor next to his hand. Julian stared at the money. "For your hard work," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't mocking. It was professional. It was the tone you use for a service worker you don't know personally. "Buy yourself some lunch, Julian. The cafeteria has a special today." She didn't wait for an answer. She stepped over his bucket and walked toward the elevators, greeting her team. Julian was left alone in the middle of the lobby. He looked at the $10. His old self would have ripped it up. His old self would have thrown it back. But his old self was dead, and the new Julian was hungry. Slowly, with a shaking hand, he reached out and picked up the wet bill. He wiped it off with his rag and put it in his pocket. He had earned it. For the first time in his miserable life, he had actually earned $1. He dipped the rag back into the bucket and kept scrubbing. Julian sat in the basement cafeteria of the sanctuary, staring at a plastic tray. On it was a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a carton of milk. It was this staff special, and it cost exactly $6. He paid for it with the $10 bill Sarah had thrown at him, and for the first time in his life, he carefully counted the $4 and change. He took a bite of the sandwich. It was dry. The bread was slightly stale. But as he chewed, Julian realized something strange. It was the best meal he had eaten in 10 years. Why? Because he wasn't eating it while terrified that his credit card would be declined. He wasn't eating it while lying to investors on the phone. He wasn't eating it while wondering if his wife had found his secret bank accounts. The anxiety that had vibrated in his chest for a decade, the constant, crushing fear of being exposed as a fraud, was gone. The worst had finally happened. He had been exposed. He had been stripped naked in front of the world. And he was still breathing. He looked around the cafeteria. At the next table, 2 other maintenance workers were laughing about a football game. They didn't care about stock prices. They didn't care about the Met Gala. They were just living. For years, Julian had looked down on men like this. He called them peasants. Now, sitting among them, he realized they were freer than he had ever been. They went home at 5 p.m. They slept at night. He finished his apple and stood up to clear his tray. As he walked to the trash can, he passed a mirror on the wall. He saw the blue jumpsuit. He saw the gray stubble on his chin because he couldn't afford expensive razors anymore. He didn't look away. He looked himself in the eye and nodded. Julian Thorne, he whispered to his reflection. Janitor. It wasn't a title that came with a yacht, but it was the first honest title he had ever held. He went back to the supply closet, picked up his mop, and for the first time since the trial, he didn't drag his feet. He had a job to do, and strangely, he wanted to do it well. 3 months passed. The sanctuary was fully operational. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a fortress for the broken. The lower floors were housing for families escaping domestic violence. The upper floors, where Julian used to throw lavish parties, were now legal clinics and therapy centers. Julian's world was small. It was the service elevator, the mop bucket, and the trash compactor. But from his invisible vantage point, he saw everything. One rainy Tuesday, he was mopping the entryway near the security desk. The automatic doors opened, and a young woman rushed in. She was soaking wet, holding a crying toddler in her arms. She had a bruise on her cheek that was turning purple. She looked terrified, constantly looking over her shoulder as if the devil himself were chasing her. Julian froze. He gripped his mop handle. He recognized that look. It was the same look Sarah used to have when he would come home drunk and angry. It was the look of someone walking on eggshells, waiting for the explosion. The receptionist, a kind woman named Maria, rushed out from behind the desk. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't ask for money. She wrapped a blanket around the woman and the child. You're safe here, Maria said softly. Nobody can hurt you here. This building belongs to Serafina Blackwood, and she protects her own. The woman collapsed into Maria's arms, sobbing with relief. He said I was worthless, the woman cried. He said I'd be nothing without him. Julian felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Those were his words. That was his script. He had said those exact things to Sarah 1,000 times. He watched them help the woman into the elevator. He saw the security guards lock the doors behind her, standing guard like sentinels. For 10 years, Julian thought he was the hero of his own movie. He thought he was the king of the tower, standing there with his mop, watching a victim find safety in the building he built but never understood. The truth finally hit him. He wasn't the king. He was the monster the castle was built to keep out. He felt a sting in his eyes. He quickly wiped his face with his sleeve, terrified someone would see him crying. He looked up at the portrait of Sarah hanging in the lobby. In the painting, she looked strong, unyielding. Thank you, he whispered to the painting. He wasn't thanking her for the job. He was thanking her for stopping him before he destroyed someone else completely. It was a Friday afternoon when the past came knocking. Julian was outside, sweeping the cigarette butts off the sidewalk near the employee entrance. A car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a limo. It was a taxi, and the person who stepped out wasn't glowing with success anymore. It was Vanessa. She looked diminished. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a jacket that looked like it came from a thrift store. Her hair was messy. The arrogance that used to radiate off her like heat was replaced by a desperate, nervous energy. She spotted Julian in his blue jumpsuit. She didn't sneer this time. She walked right up to him, a fake, bright smile plastered on her face. Julian, she exclaimed, reaching out to touch his arm. My God, I've been looking everywhere for you. Julian stepped back, avoiding her touch. He leaned on his broom. Hello, Vanessa. You're standing in a loading zone. Vanessa laughed, a nervous titter. She told him to stop joking. She launched into a story. She told him that Derek Vance, the rival who had stolen her, was a jerk. He had kicked her out. He was boring. He wasn't visionary like Julian. She moved closer, lowering her voice. She told Julian that she knew this janitor thing was just a part of his legal strategy. She whispered that she knew he must have money hidden away in the Cayman Islands. She said she was willing to forgive him for the scandal. She was ready to be a team again. She suggested they run away together, dig up his secret millions, and live on a beach in Brazil. Julian looked at her. He really looked at her. 3 months ago, he would have killed for this woman's validation. He would have stolen from orphans to buy her a purse. Now, he just saw a sad, empty person looking for a host. "I don't have any money, Vanessa," Julian said calmly. "I make $12 an hour. I take the bus." Vanessa's smile faltered. "Stop it. You're Julian Thorne. You always have an angle." "The angle is gone," he said. "And so is the money. This is it. This is who I am." Vanessa stared at him. The mask dropped. Her face twisted into a sneer. "You're serious? You're actually just a garbage man." "Sanitation specialist," Julian corrected her. "You're pathetic," she spat. "I wasted 2 years on you." She turned to storm off, but then stopped. She looked back at him, her eyes narrowing. "Can you at least give me $20 for the cab? I left my wallet at Derek's." Julian reached into his pocket. He felt the crumpled bills of his weekly tips. He had $20. He could give it to her. It would be the gentlemanly thing to do. He pulled his hand out. It was empty. "Sorry," Julian said, picking up his dustpan. "My money is for family only. And you? You were just a bad investment." He turned his back on her and started sweeping. "Julian," she screamed. "Don't you walk away from me. You're nothing without me." Julian didn't turn around. He kept sweeping, the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom drowning out her insults. He heard the taxi door slam. He heard the car drive away. He took a deep breath of the city air. It smelled of exhaust and rain, but to Julian, it smelled like victory. He had just passed the final test. The old Julian was dead, and the new Julian had a sidewalk to clean. While Julian was scraping gum off the sidewalks, Serafina was fighting a war on a different front. She took a private elevator to the sub-basement of the Blackwood Citadel, a secure bunker that served as the meeting place for the syndicate's ruling families. The room was cold, lit only by recessed lighting. Around the circular table sat the 5 heads of the other major banking dynasties. These were people who viewed the President of the United States as a mid-level manager. They were the true power, and they were not happy. The chairman, an elderly man named Mr. Roth who breathed with the help of an oxygen tank, spoke first. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was lethal. He told Serafina that her project with Julian Thorne was becoming a problem. He explained that the syndicate operated on fear and absolute consequences. By letting Julian live, and worse, by giving him a job, she was showing weakness. He argued that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. He threw a dossier on the table. It contained photos of Julian sweeping the streets. Roth leaned forward, the hiss of his oxygen tank filling the silence. He told her that a king does not let the jester live in the palace after an attempted coup. He demanded that Julian be removed permanently. He suggested a prison accident. Clean. Quiet. Final. Serafina didn't flinch. She stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on the cold steel. She looked Roth in the eye and told him he was wrong. She explained that killing Julian would make him a martyr. It would make people ask questions. But keeping him, she said, her voice echoing in the bunker, making him serve the very people he despised? That is not mercy, Mr. Roth. That is a warning. She gestured to the screen on the wall, which showed a live feed of Julian cleaning the lobby of the sanctuary. She told the families that every time a rival businessman walked past that window and saw Julian Thorne scrubbing the floor, they learned a lesson. Do not cross the Blackwood family, or you won't just lose your life, you will lose your dignity. The table went silent. The logic was cold, cruel, and perfect. It was the kind of psychological warfare the syndicate respected. Roth sat back, a thin smile appearing on his face. He agreed to let Julian live, for now. But he issued a warning of his own. He told Serafina that the moment Julian became a liability, the moment he slipped up or caused a scandal, the syndicate would intervene, and they wouldn't use a mop. They would use a bullet. Serafina nodded, accepting the terms. She left the bunker with her head held high, but inside, her heart was racing. She had bought Julian time, but she had placed a target on his back. One mistake, and she wouldn't be able to save him. 2 weeks later, the city was hit by a massive heat wave. The sanctuary was packed to capacity, its air conditioning systems straining to keep the mothers and children cool. It was 11 p.m. Julian was on the graveyard shift, doing his rounds in the basement mechanical rooms. This was his favorite time to work. It was quiet, just him and the hum of the machines. He walked past the massive HVAC units, industrial-sized air conditioners that cooled the 50-story tower. He knew these machines intimately. He had purchased them himself 5 years ago, bragging at the time that they were the Ferrari of air conditioners. He stopped. Something was wrong. The hum of Unit 3 was different. It wasn't the steady drone of a compressor. It was a high-pitched whine, followed by a rhythmic clunk, clunk, clunk. Julian frowned. He unlocked the cage surrounding the unit. He shined his flashlight into the access panel. What he saw made his blood run cold. The safety valve on the coolant line hadn't just broken, it had been wrenched open. And sitting next to the intake fan was a small, crudely wired device attached to a canister of industrial solvent. Julian's mind raced. He recognized the setup immediately. It wasn't a bomb meant to blow up the building. It was a chemical dispersion rig. If that canister opened, the fan would suck the solvent fumes into the ventilation system. It would pump toxic gas into every room in the tower, the sleeping children, the staff, everyone. It wouldn't kill them instantly, but it would cause mass panic, sickness, and force an immediate, chaotic evacuation. It was sabotage. Someone was trying to shut down the sanctuary. He heard a noise behind him, the scuff of a boot on concrete. Julian spun around. Standing in the shadows was a man wearing a generic maintenance uniform, but Julian knew every member of the night crew, and he didn't know this man. The intruder was holding a heavy wrench. "You shouldn't be here, janitor," the man growled. "Walk away, and you live." Julian looked at the device. The timer on the canister read 0:45. 45 seconds. He looked at the intruder. The man was younger, bigger, and armed. Julian Thorne had spent his life running from fights. He had spent his life paying other people to handle his problems. He looked at the service elevator that led to the street. He could run. He could pull the fire alarm and sprint out the back door. No one would blame him. He was just the cleaning guy. But then he thought about the woman he saw last week. He thought about the kids sleeping on the 4th floor. He thought about Sarah, upstairs in her office, working late. Julian tightened his grip on his heavy flashlight. "No," Julian said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "This is my building." He didn't run away. He stepped forward. The intruder lunged, swinging the wrench at Julian's head. Julian ducked instinctively, the heavy metal whistling past his ear. He wasn't a fighter, but he was desperate. He swung his heavy mag light, striking the man in the ribs. The intruder grunted but didn't go down. He shoved Julian backward, slamming him into the metal casing of the HVAC unit. Pain exploded in Julian's shoulder, but he scrambled up. He saw the timer, 0:20. The intruder raised the wrench for a killing blow. Julian looked around for a weapon. His hand landed on the high-pressure steam release valve for the boiler next to him. "Duck," Julian whispered. He yanked the lever down. A jet of scalding hot steam blasted out of the pipe, directly into the space between them. The intruder screamed, blindingly disoriented by the white-hot fog. He dropped the wrench and stumbled back, covering his face. Julian didn't wait. He dove through the steam, ignoring the blistering heat on his arms. He reached the sabotage device. 0:08. He saw the wires, red and blue. He didn't know anything about bombs, but he knew plumbing. He grabbed the canister of solvent and ripped it loose from the intake fan, tearing the wires out with brute force. He threw the canister across the room just as the small detonator popped. It was a small crack, like a firecracker. Without the fan to suck it up, the small puff of gas dissipated harmlessly into the large basement. The intruder, realizing the plan had failed and the steam alarm was blaring, scrambled for the exit door. He fled into the night. Julian slid down the wall, coughing. The steam had shut off, but the air was hot and wet. He looked at his arms. His jumpsuit was scorched, and the skin on his forearms was angry red from the steam burns. His shoulder throbbed where he had hit the machine. The basement door burst open. Security guards rushed in, weapons drawn, followed by Frank, the head of maintenance. "Thorne," Frank yelled, seeing Julian on the floor. "What did you do?" "The alarms are going crazy." Julian looked at the sabotaged machine. He looked at the broken valve. If he told them he fought an intruder, it would be an investigation. Police, press, the syndicate would get involved. They might think he did it. Roth's warning echoed in his head. One mistake, and he's gone. He knew that if he claimed to be a hero, no one would believe him. They would think he staged it to get time off his sentence. So, Julian made a choice. I slipped, Julian wheezed, hiding his burned arms behind his back. I bumped the steam valve. I was trying to clean behind the unit. I'm sorry, Frank. Frank looked at the steam. He looked at the mess. He shook his head in disgust. You clumsy idiot. You could have blown the compressor. Get out of here. Go to the clinic and get yourself bandaged up. I'll write you up in the morning. Julian nodded, swallowing the pain. Yes, sir. He limped out of the basement, past the security guards who looked at him with contempt. He had saved the building. He had saved Sarah. And now he was going to get written up for it. As he rode the service elevator up to the clinic, a strange sensation washed over him. He was in pain. He was in trouble. And he was uncredited. But for the first time in his life, he felt clean. He realized that true power wasn't about getting credit for the good things you do. It was about doing them even when you knew you'd be punished for it. Up in the penthouse security room, however, someone was watching. Serafina stood in front of the monitor wall. She rewound the footage from camera B4. She watched Julian fight the intruder. She watched him pull the steam valve. She watched him rip the bomb away with seconds to spare. And she watched him lie to Frank to protect the shelter from a police investigation. She paused the video on Julian's face, painful, exhausted, but determined. He didn't run, she whispered, her hand hovering over the screen. Beside her, the chief of security asked, Do you want me to bring him in, Madam Blackwood? No, Serafina said softly. Let him heal. And cancel his write-up. Tell Frank it was a mechanical error. She looked at the image of her ex-husband one last time. The jester is dead, she murmured. We might just have a night after all. 6 months passed. The winter turned to spring, and the ice around the sanctuary melted, revealing a building that was thriving. Julian Thorne had become a ghost in the machine. He was no longer the clumsy new guy who burned his arms on steam valves. He was a fixture. He knew which elevator squeaked on the 3rd floor. He knew that the boiler needed to be kicked twice to start on Tuesdays. He knew the names of every child living in the shelter. He still wore the blue jumpsuit. It was faded now, stained with grease and bleach, but he wore it with a strange kind of dignity. He walked with his head up, not looking for approval, but simply looking for work. One afternoon, while emptying the recycling bins in the administrative wing, Julian found something that made him stop. Sitting on top of a stack of discarded papers was a glossy business magazine. It was an old issue, dated a year ago. On the cover was a photo of a man in a $5,000 tuxedo, holding a glass of champagne, smiling arrogantly at the camera. The headline read, Julian Thorne, the king of the skyline. Julian picked up the magazine. He stared at the face. He remembered that day. He remembered shouting at the photographer because the lighting wasn't right. He remembered firing his assistant 10 minutes later because the champagne wasn't cold enough. He looked at the photo, and he felt nothing. No longing. No nostalgia. It was like looking at a stranger, a loud, insecure stranger he didn't like very much. Hey, Thorne. Julian turned. It was Frank, the head of maintenance. Frank wasn't yelling this time. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. Break time, Frank said, offering a cup. I brought you the good stuff. Not that swill from the machine. Julian took the coffee. It was warm in his hands. Thanks, Frank. Frank nodded at the magazine. Thinking about the old days? Julian looked at the cover one last time. He thought about the empty penthouse. He thought about the fake friends at the country club. He thought about the cold, lonely nights wondering who was trying to steal his money. Then he looked at the coffee. He looked at Frank, a man who had visited him in the clinic when he burned his arms, even though he didn't have to. No, Julian said softly. I don't know that guy. He tossed the magazine into the shredder. The machine roared to life, chewing up the king of the skyline into confetti. Julian took a sip of his coffee. It was cheap, sugary, and perfect. He realized then that he was poorer than he had ever been. But for the first time in 40 years, he wasn't bankrupt. On the 1-year anniversary of the gala incident, the Blackwood Sanctuary was quiet. The lights were dimmed for the night. High above the city, on the balcony of the penthouse, the very same balcony where Sarah had made the phone call that changed everything, Serafina stood alone. The wind whipped her hair, but she didn't move. She was looking down at the driveway, 50 stories below. She held the matte black satellite phone in her hand, the device that summoned armies. She wasn't looking at the limousines. She was looking at a solitary figure down on the pavement. It was Julian. He was sweeping the leaves off the front steps. He moved with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Swish, swish. He stopped to pick up a discarded candy wrapper, putting it in his pocket so it wouldn't blow away. Serafina watched him. She knew the truth about the sabotage. She knew he had saved the building. She knew he had taken the blame to protect her sanctuary from a scandal. She unlocked the phone. She scrolled to the contact labeled Julian Thorne, debt record. The screen showed the balance, 5 years service remaining. She hovered her thumb over the delete button. She could end it now. She could send an email, tell him his debt was paid, and set him free. He could go back to the world, maybe start over. But then, she hesitated. She watched him down below. A resident of the shelter, a young mother, walked past him. Julian stopped sweeping. He held the door open for her. He smiled. It wasn't his old salesman smile. It was a genuine, tired, human smile. The woman smiled back and thanked him. Serafina realized something. If she sent him away, she wasn't freeing him. She would be casting him out of the only place where he had ever found purpose. He didn't need to be forgiven. He needed to be useful. She lowered the phone. She didn't delete the debt. Instead, she pressed a different button. She dialed the head of human resources. Yes, Madam Blackwood. The voice answered, startled by the late call. Update Julian Thorne's file, Serafina said, her voice carrying over the wind. Give him a raise. $15 an hour. And give him a key to the front door. He's earned it. Yes, madam. Serafina hung up. She looked down at the tiny figure one last time. He was still sweeping, clearing the path for others to walk safely. She turned and walked back into the warmth of the penthouse, leaving the satellite phone on the railing. She didn't need it anymore. She had learned the ultimate lesson of power. You don't defeat a monster by killing him. You defeat him by teaching him how to be a man. And down below, in the cool night air, Julian Thorne kept sweeping, unaware that the Queen was watching, and unaware that for the first time in his life, he was finally, truly, home.